The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows across the weathered manuscript as Lorenzo de' Medici set down his wine goblet with trembling hands. The year was 1513, and the political landscape of Renaissance Italy had shifted like quicksand beneath the feet of princes and peasants alike. In a modest dwelling outside Florence, a disgraced diplomat named Niccolò Machiavelli was penning what would become history's most controversial guide to power, a treatise that would forever change how humanity understood the brutal mathematics of political survival. Machiavelli's quill scratched against parchment as he wrestled with a fundamental question that had plagued him since his exile from Florence's political circles: why do good men fail as leaders while ruthless tyrants prosper? The answer, he realized, lay not in moral philosophy or divine providence, but in understanding power as a raw, unforgiving force that rewards those who master its darkest secrets. The treatise that emerged from this period of reflection, Il Principe, or The Prince, would scandalize Europe for centuries to come. Yet beneath its shocking pragmatism lay insights so profound that they continue to shape the corridors of power today. These lessons, distilled from Machiavelli's observations of successful and failed rulers, formed a blueprint for navigating the treacherous waters of human ambition and political necessity. Part 1: The illusion of noble leadership in the grand halls of the Palazzo Vecchio, where Machiavelli had once served as secretary to the Second Chancery of the Republic of Florence. He had witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of idealistic leadership. Piero Soderini, the Republic's leader, embodied everything that moral philosophers claimed a ruler should be: honest, compassionate, and committed to justice. Yet it was precisely these virtues that led to his downfall when the Medici family returned to power with Spanish backing in 1512. Machiavelli watched as Soderini's unwillingness to employ necessary cruelties, to execute conspirators, to break treaties when advantageous, to inspire fear alongside love rendered him impotent against more ruthless adversaries. The lesson was stark and undeniable: in the arena of power, moral purity often equated to political suicide. This observation formed the foundation of Machiavelli's first dangerous lesson, that the conventional morality taught in churches and philosophy schools was not merely inadequate for rulers, it was actively harmful. A prince who attempted to maintain perfect virtue in all his actions would inevitably be destroyed by those who felt no such constraints. The world, Machiavelli observed, was not populated by saints but by ambitious, self-interested individuals who would exploit any weakness they perceived in their opponents. Consider the fate of Julius Caesar, whose clemency toward his enemies ultimately cost him his life. On the Ides of March, it was not Caesar's cruelties that brought about his assassination, but his mercies. Brutus and Cassius, whom Caesar had pardoned and elevated to positions of honor, were the very men who plunged their daggers into his body. Had Caesar followed the more ruthless path of his predecessors, eliminating potential threats rather than attempting to win them through magnanimity, the Roman Republic might never have fallen. Machiavelli's analysis extended beyond individual cases to examine the structural dynamics of power itself. He observed that political authority rested not on abstract moral principles but on the ability to inspire both love and fear in subjects. However, when forced to choose between the two, a wise ruler would always select fear over love. Love, being dependent on the whims and self-interest of others, could evaporate overnight when circumstances changed. Fear, properly calibrated, provided a more reliable foundation for obedience. This insight led to one of Machiavelli's most chilling observations, that successful rulers must cultivate a dual nature, like the mythical centaur Chiron who was both man and beast. They must know when to employ human reason and diplomacy, and when to unleash the predatory instincts of the lion and the cunning of the fox. The ruler who relied solely on human virtues would be devoured by those who understood the necessity of controlled barbarism. The historical record supported this thesis with disturbing consistency. Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, provided Machiavelli with a perfect case study in effective ruthlessness. When Borgia conquered the Romagna region of Italy, he found it plagued by corrupt local officials and feuding noble families. Rather than attempting gradual reform through persuasion and legal processes, Borgia appointed Ramiro di Orco, a cruel but efficient administrator, to pacify the region through terror and violence. De Orco's brutal methods quickly restored order, but they also made him deeply hated by the population. Recognizing this, Borgia made a calculated move that demonstrated his mastery of political theater. He had de Orco arrested, tried, and executed in the public square of Cesena, his body cut in half and displayed for all to see. The message was clear: Borgia had eliminated the source of the people's suffering while simultaneously demonstrating that he would not tolerate excessive cruelty in his subordinates. This single act accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It satisfied the population's desire for justice against their tormentor, established Borgia's reputation for decisive action, and sent a chilling message to other administrators about the consequences of disappointing their prince. Most importantly, it allowed Borgia to distance himself from the harsh methods that had been necessary to establish his authority, while retaining the benefits of the order they had created. Machiavelli marveled at the sophistication of this maneuver, recognizing it as a masterpiece of political calculation. Borgia had understood that the effective exercise of power required not just the willingness to employ violence, but the wisdom to know when to disavow it. He had made himself simultaneously feared and feared by potential enemies who sought his capacity for decisive action, and loved by subjects who credited him with ending their suffering. The lesson extended far beyond the specific context of Renaissance Italy. Throughout history, successful leaders had demonstrated this same understanding of power's dual nature. Augustus Caesar built the Roman Empire not through consistent virtue, but by knowing when to show mercy and when to order the proscription lists that condemned hundreds of senators to death. Elizabeth I of England maintained her throne for 45 years not through gentle feminine virtues, but by executing Mary Queen of Scots when political necessity demanded it, despite her personal reluctance to kill a fellow queen. Yet Machiavelli's most radical insight was not simply that rulers must occasionally abandon moral principles, but that they must abandon the very framework of conventional morality altogether. The question for a prince was not, is this action right or wrong, but rather, will this action strengthen or weaken my position? This represented a fundamental shift from medieval political thought, which had attempted to reconcile earthly power with divine mandate, to a purely practical science of governance. This pragmatic approach extended to every aspect of statecraft. Treaties should be kept only as long as they served the prince's interests. Promises could be broken if circumstances changed. Allies could be sacrificed if they became liabilities. The only constant principle was the preservation and expansion of power itself, which Machiavelli saw as the prerequisite for any other accomplishment a ruler might hope to achieve. Critics of Machiavelli have often portrayed this philosophy as crude opportunism, but such interpretations miss the sophistication of his analysis. Machiavelli was not advocating random or sadistic cruelty, but rather the calculated use of morally questionable means in service of larger political objectives. The ruler who employed violence, deception, or betrayal merely for personal satisfaction was as foolish as the one who refused to employ them when necessity demanded. The true Machiavellian prince understood that power was not an end in itself, but a tool for achieving stability, prosperity, and security for the state. Sometimes these objectives required actions that conventional morality would condemn, but the alternative, weakness, chaos, and eventual destruction, was far worse than any temporary moral compromise. In Machiavelli's worldview, the greatest sin was not cruelty or deception, but incompetence in the face of political necessity. This philosophy found its ultimate expression in Machiavelli's famous assertion that the ends justify the means, though he never used those exact words. What he argued was that a ruler who achieved lasting peace and prosperity through harsh methods was more virtuous than one whose adherence to conventional morality led to war, suffering, and social collapse. The true measure of political virtue was not the purity of one's methods, but the quality of one's results. As Machiavelli worked late into the night, crafting arguments that would horrify the moral philosophers of his age, he was not motivated by cynicism or misanthropy. Rather, he was driven by a desire to provide future leaders with the intellectual tools necessary to navigate the brutal realities of political life. He had seen too many good men fail because they could not bring themselves to make the hard choices that leadership demanded, and too many states suffer because their rulers preferred the comfort of moral certainty to the messy compromises of effective governance. The first part of Machiavelli's dangerous education, therefore, was the recognition that conventional morality was a luxury that leaders could not afford. This did not mean that rulers should become monsters, delighting in cruelty for its own sake, but rather that they must be prepared to transcend ordinary moral categories when the welfare of the state demanded it. The prince who could not bring himself to order an execution, break a promise, or deceive an enemy was like a general who refused to fight, noble, perhaps, but ultimately useless in the position he had chosen to occupy. Part 2. The Art of Necessary Cruelty. The second phase of Machiavelli's education in power concerned itself with a concept that would prove even more disturbing to his contemporaries: the notion that not only was cruelty sometimes necessary in politics, but that it could be performed skillfully or clumsily, with profound implications for its effectiveness. In the blood-soaked landscape of Renaissance Italy, where city-states rose and fell with startling regularity, Machiavelli observed that successful rulers were those who understood cruelty as an art form requiring precise timing, proper dosage, and strategic purpose. The distinction between well-executed and poorly executed cruelty became clear to Machiavelli through his study of two contrasting figures, Agathocles of Syracuse and Oliverado da Fermo. Both men had risen to power through spectacular acts of violence, but their ultimate fates differed dramatically due to their understanding, or lack thereof, of how to employ harsh measures effectively. Agathocles, a potter's son who became tyrant of Syracuse in the 4th century BC, demonstrated what Machiavelli considered the proper use of revolutionary violence. Faced with opposition from the Senate and wealthy citizens who despised his humble origins, Agathocles convened a meeting of the city's elite under the pretense of discussing matters of mutual concern. Once they were assembled and defenseless, he ordered his soldiers to massacre them all, along with their families and supporters throughout the city. This act of stunning brutality served multiple purposes simultaneously. It eliminated all potential centers of resistance to his rule, redistributed wealth from the old aristocracy to Agathocles' supporters, and demonstrated to any remaining opposition the futility of challenging his authority. Most crucially, the violence was concentrated into a single, decisive moment rather than being drawn out over months or years. After this initial bloodbath, Agathocles was able to rule relatively peacefully for decades, earning the loyalty of common citizens through effective governance and military victories. In contrast, Oliverado da Fermo's approach to political violence demonstrated the consequences of cruelty poorly applied. After seizing control of his hometown through treachery, inviting his uncle and other leading citizens to a feast before having them murdered, Oliverado made the fatal error of allowing his cruelties to become ongoing rather than decisive. He continued to rely on violence and intimidation as his primary tools of governance, creating a climate of perpetual fear and resentment among his subjects. More importantly, Oliverado failed to understand that the effectiveness of initial cruelty depended on its completeness. By leaving potential enemies alive and allowing word of his methods to spread beyond his immediate territory, he marked himself as a threat that other rulers would need to eliminate. When Cesare Borgia decided to consolidate control over the Papal States, Oliverado was an obvious target, a dangerous upstart whose methods made him both powerful and isolated. The contrast between these two cases illuminated what Machiavelli considered one of the most important principles in the exercise of power: that cruelties must be committed all at once, while benefits should be distributed gradually over time. The psychological reasoning behind this principle was profound. When harsh measures are concentrated into a brief period, people quickly adapt to the new reality and, if the ruler subsequently governs well, may even come to appreciate the stability that followed the initial chaos. However, when cruelties are spread out over months or years, they become a constant source of anxiety and resentment. Each new act of violence reminds subjects of previous injuries and creates anticipation of future harm. Rather than accepting their situation and moving on with their lives, people living under such conditions remain in a state of perpetual tension, always looking for opportunities to escape or rebel. Machiavelli's analysis of this principle extended beyond individual psychology to encompass broader social dynamics. A society that experienced intense but brief upheaval could rebuild its institutions and relationships around new realities. Citizens could form new loyalties, establish new routines, and develop new expectations about how their government would operate. But a society subjected to ongoing uncertainty and violence remained fractured and unstable, unable to develop the social bonds that made effective governance possible. The historical examples that supported this principle were numerous and compelling. Oliver Cromwell's rise to power in England during the 1640s demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of revolutionary violence. Cromwell's decision to execute King Charles I was shocking in its finality, but it eliminated the primary symbol around which royalist resistance could organize. However, his subsequent rule was marked by ongoing political purges and military interventions that kept English society in a state of constant tension until his death. Similarly, the French Revolution illustrated the dangers of prolonged revolutionary terror. The initial overthrow of the old regime created opportunities for genuine social transformation, but the convention's decision to institutionalize violence through the Committee of Public Safety and the Revolutionary Tribunal ultimately consumed the revolution itself. By the time Robespierre fell to the guillotine, French society was exhausted by years of bloodshed and ready to accept almost any alternative that promised stability. Machiavelli's insights into the proper timing of cruelty extended to its targeting as well. Effective political violence was discriminating rather than indiscriminate, focused on eliminating specific threats rather than terrorizing entire populations. The ruler who understood this distinction could achieve his objectives with minimal bloodshed, while the one who employed violence carelessly would create unnecessary enemies and undermine his own position. The case of Ivan the Terrible of Russia provided a cautionary example of how even the most powerful rulers could destroy themselves through excessive cruelty. Ivan's early reign had been marked by significant reforms and military victories, earning him genuine support from many of his subjects. However, his establishment of the Oprichnina, a personal army that terrorized Russian nobles and peasants alike, demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of violence as a political tool. Rather than targeting specific threats to his authority, Ivan's forces engaged in random acts of brutality that served no clear political purpose. Entire cities were destroyed on the basis of vague suspicions, noble families were exterminated for imagined conspiracies, and the productive capacity of the Russian state was systematically undermined through mindless destruction. By the end of his reign, Ivan ruled over a devastated country whose population had been decimated by his own policies. The contrast with more successful autocrats was striking. Louis XI of France, known as the Spider King for his intricate web of spies and informants, employed violence much more selectively. When dealing with rebellious nobles during the War of the Public Weal, Louis avoided large-scale military confrontations that would have devastated the countryside. Instead, he used targeted assassinations, strategic bribes, and carefully orchestrated betrayals to isolate and eliminate his enemies one by one. This approach required more patience and sophistication than Ivan's methods, but it preserved French society's productive capacity while achieving similar political objectives. By the end of Louis's reign, France had emerged as Europe's dominant power, its royal authority unchallenged and its economy stronger than ever. The key difference lay not in the willingness to use violence, but in understanding how to use it efficiently and discriminately. Machiavelli's analysis also revealed that the effectiveness of cruelty depended heavily on the ruler's ability to control its narrative meaning. Successful leaders understood that political violence was as much a form of communication as a method of eliminating opposition. The manner in which harsh measures were carried out, the explanations offered for their necessity, and the symbolism surrounding their implementation could determine whether they were seen as just punishment or tyrannical oppression. Cesare Borgia's execution of Ramiro di Orco again provided the perfect illustration of this principle. By staging the execution as a public spectacle and framing it as justice for the administrator's excessive cruelties, Borgia transformed what might have been seen as arbitrary violence into an act of moral leadership. The visual impact of de Orco's bisected corpse in the town square communicated multiple messages simultaneously: that Borgia would not tolerate incompetence, that he cared about his subjects' welfare, and that he possessed the power to deliver swift justice to anyone who crossed him. The timing of this execution was equally important. By waiting until order had been restored in the Romagna before turning against de Orco, Borgia demonstrated that he was not acting out of anger or caprice, but from calculated political judgment. The population could see that Borgia had used de Orco as a necessary tool and, then, discarded him when his usefulness was exhausted, a cold calculation, perhaps, but one that served their interests as well as his own. This manipulation of political symbolism required a sophisticated understanding of public psychology that went far beyond mere willingness to employ violence. Successful rulers needed to be students of human nature, capable of anticipating how their actions would be interpreted by different audiences and adjusting their methods accordingly. They had to consider not only the immediate practical effects of their decisions, but also their long-term impact on public opinion and political legitimacy. The challenge was made more complex by the fact that different groups within society might interpret the same actions in completely different ways. What appeared as necessary firmness to supporters might be seen as cruel oppression by opponents. What seemed like just punishment to victims of previous policies might look like arbitrary violence to neutral observers. The skilled prince had to navigate these competing interpretations while maintaining his core political objectives. Machiavelli observed that the most successful rulers were those who could employ necessary cruelties while maintaining plausible justifications for their actions. They surrounded themselves with advisors who could provide alternative explanations for harsh measures, created institutional frameworks that gave their decisions an appearance of legal authority, and cultivated relationships with chroniclers and historians who would present their reigns in favorable terms for posterity. This attention to perception and narrative revealed another crucial aspect of Machiavellian statecraft: the recognition that power operated as much through appearance as through reality. A ruler who was genuinely weak but appeared strong might survive longer than one who was genuinely strong but appeared weak. Similarly, a leader who employed moderate cruelties that were highly visible might achieve greater deterrent effects than one who committed greater atrocities in secret. The implications of this insight extended to every aspect of political life. The prince's court, his public ceremonies, his architectural projects, and even his personal appearance all became tools for communicating messages about his power and intentions. The ruler who understood this could amplify the effects of his actual capabilities through careful attention to symbolic representation, while the one who neglected these considerations might find his real strengths undermined by poor presentation. As Machiavelli developed these themes in his nighttime writings, he was constructing a new science of power that treated human psychology as seriously as military strategy or economic policy. The traditional separation between private virtue and public necessity was being replaced by a more complex understanding of how personal character, political calculation, and social dynamics intersected to determine a ruler's success or failure. The art of necessary cruelty, therefore, was not simply about knowing when and how to employ violence, but about understanding the entire ecosystem of power relationships that determined how such actions would be received and interpreted. The prince who mastered this art could achieve his objectives with minimal bloodshed, while the one who remained ignorant of these principles might find himself forced into increasingly desperate measures that ultimately destroyed both his enemies and himself. Part 3: The Fox and the Lion. Mastering deception and force. As the candle burned lower in his modest study, Machiavelli turned to what he considered the most sophisticated aspect of political leadership: the ability to seamlessly alternate between the complementary strategies of the fox and the lion. This metaphor, drawn from classical antiquity, encapsulated his belief that successful rulers must master two fundamentally different approaches to power: the lion's capacity for overwhelming force and the fox's genius for cunning manipulation. The prince who relied exclusively on either strategy would inevitably face situations where his preferred methods proved inadequate, leaving him vulnerable to more adaptable adversaries. The lion represented the most obvious aspect of princely power: the ability to intimidate enemies through displays of strength, to crush opposition through superior force, and to inspire respect through demonstrations of unwavering resolve. History was filled with rulers who had achieved greatness primarily through their mastery of this leonine approach. Alexander the Great had conquered most of the known world through military genius and personal courage. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon with his legions, choosing civil war over political humiliation. Napoleon had reshaped Europe through the application of revolutionary military strategies that made traditional armies obsolete. Yet Machiavelli understood that brute force alone was insufficient for long-term political success. The lion could win battles, but the fox was needed to avoid unnecessary conflicts, to divide enemies against each other, and to achieve objectives that force could never accomplish. The most dangerous adversaries were not always those who could be defeated in open combat, but those who operated in shadows, using information, money, and social connections to undermine their opponents' positions before any direct confrontation occurred. The career of Ferdinand of Aragon provided Machiavelli with his most compelling example of fox-like cunning in action. Ferdinand had transformed Spain from a collection of fractious kingdoms into Europe's dominant power not primarily through military conquest, but through a series of brilliant strategic deceptions that left his enemies confused, isolated, and ultimately helpless. His methods were so subtle that many of his victims never fully understood how they had been outmaneuvered until it was far too late to recover. Ferdinand's conquest of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, demonstrated the fox principle in its most refined form. Rather than launching a costly direct assault on the well-fortified city, Ferdinand exploited internal divisions within the Granadian leadership, supporting different factions against each other while presenting himself as a potential mediator. He signed truces that he had no intention of honoring, used periods of peace to strengthen his own forces while encouraging his enemies to relax their vigilance, and manipulated the flow of information to ensure that Grenadian leaders made decisions based on false assumptions about their strategic situation. The psychological warfare that accompanied this campaign was equally sophisticated. Ferdinand arranged for carefully selected prisoners to be released with stories about Spanish military preparations that were simultaneously true and misleading, true in their basic details but calculated to encourage the wrong defensive responses. He allowed certain Spanish military plans to be discovered by Grenadian spies, knowing that the intelligence would be acted upon in ways that actually served his objectives. Most brilliantly, he used his reputation for religious devotion to mask aggressive intentions as defensive measures, claiming that each escalation was necessary to protect Christian pilgrims or to respond to Muslim provocations. By the time Granada's leaders realized the full scope of Ferdinand's strategy, their position had become untenable. The city's alliances had been systematically undermined, its resources had been drained by years of misdirected defensive preparations, and its population had been demoralized by a series of seemingly unconnected setbacks that were actually part of a coordinated campaign. The final siege was almost anticlimactic. The real victory had been achieved through months of patient manipulation that made military resistance futile. This combination of strategic patience and tactical deception became Ferdinand's signature approach throughout his reign. When dealing with French ambitions in Italy, he avoided direct confrontation with armies he might not be able to defeat, instead working to create coalitions that would force France to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. He signed agreements with various Italian states while secretly negotiating contradictory arrangements with their enemies, ensuring that no single power could achieve dominance while positioning Spain to benefit from whatever outcome emerged. The complexity of these maneuvers required an intelligence network that extended throughout Europe, providing Ferdinand with detailed information about the internal politics of every significant court. He cultivated relationships with nobles, merchants, clerics, and scholars who could provide insights into their rulers' intentions, weaknesses, and domestic constraints. This information allowed him to tailor his approaches to exploit specific vulnerabilities while avoiding areas where his targets were strongest. Machiavelli marveled at Ferdinand's ability to maintain multiple contradictory relationships simultaneously without losing credibility with any of his partners. The Spanish king understood that different audiences evaluated trustworthiness according to different criteria, and he adapted his behavior accordingly. With fellow monarchs, he emphasized shared interests in maintaining royal authority against popular rebellions. With merchants, he stressed the commercial benefits of political stability. With church leaders, he highlighted his commitment to advancing Christian interests against Muslim and Protestant threats. This flexibility in presentation was made possible by Ferdinand's careful attention to information compartmentalization. He ensured that his various partners knew only what they needed to know about his other relationships, preventing them from recognizing the contradictions that might have undermined his credibility. When conflicts between his commitments became unavoidable, he attributed them to changed circumstances or new information that had forced him to reconsider his previous positions. The contrast with more straightforward rulers was illuminating. Charles VIII of France had invaded Italy with overwhelming military force, achieving spectacular initial victories that seemed to validate the Lion's approach to international politics. The French army swept aside all opposition, captured Naples with minimal resistance, and appeared to have established French dominance over the Italian peninsula within a matter of months. However, Charles's success was undermined by his failure to understand the Fox principle. While he focused on military conquest, Ferdinand worked behind the scenes to organize the League of Venice, bringing together Spain, Austria, Milan, and Venice in opposition to French expansion. Rather than confronting Charles directly, the League members used diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and the threat of coordinated military action to force him into an untenable position. The psychological pressure proved more effective than any military campaign could have been. Charles found himself isolated in hostile territory, with supply lines that could be cut at any moment and allies who had been systematically turned against him. When he finally attempted to return to France, his retreat became a humiliating rout that destroyed his army's morale and discredited his entire Italian strategy. The kingdom he had conquered through force dissolved as soon as that force was withdrawn. Machiavelli drew from this comparison one of his most important insights about the relationship between fox and lion strategies, that deception was often more durable than coercion because it was less likely to provoke unified resistance. Charles's military approach had created obvious enemies who could see exactly what they were fighting against and why they needed to cooperate. Ferdinand's methods, by contrast, worked through existing tensions and rivalries, allowing his opponents to defeat each other while believing they were pursuing their own independent interests. This principle applied equally to domestic politics, where rulers faced the constant challenge of maintaining authority over subjects who might unite against them if they felt uniformly oppressed. The wise prince understood that it was better to have his subjects competing against each other for his favor than to have them cooperating against his rule. This required careful attention to the balance of power among different social groups, ensuring that no single faction became strong enough to challenge royal authority while preventing any group from becoming so weak that it might be driven to desperate rebellion. The techniques for maintaining this balance were subtle and varied. A ruler might grant economic privileges to merchants while restricting their political influence, keeping them dependent on royal favor for their prosperity. He could allow nobles to maintain their social status while gradually reducing their independent military capacity. He might encourage religious diversity to prevent any single clerical hierarchy from accumulating too much influence, or support multiple competing intellectual traditions to ensure that scholars never presented a unified challenge to official policies. The key insight was that divide-and-conquer strategies worked best when the divisions appeared to arise naturally from genuine disagreements rather than from obvious manipulation. The prince who was seen as playing different groups against each other would eventually face a coalition of his victims seeking revenge. But, the one who could exploit existing tensions while appearing to remain neutral or even while appearing to seek compromise could maintain his position indefinitely. Louis XI of France had demonstrated this principle through his handling of the powerful Burgundian duchy. Rather than launching a direct military campaign against Charles the Bold, Louis encouraged Charles's enemies within his own territories while simultaneously offering him support against external threats. This created a situation where Charles was constantly fighting on multiple fronts, never able to consolidate his position or focus his resources on any single objective. The genius of Louis's approach was that he managed to appear as both friend and enemy to Charles simultaneously, depending on the specific context. When Charles faced rebellions from his own subjects, Louis offered military assistance that came with conditions ensuring French influence over Burgundian policy. When Charles attempted to expand his territories, Louis organized coalitions that included some of Charles's own vassals, who were promised better treatment under French protection. This complex diplomatic dance continued for years, gradually weakening Burgundy's position while strengthening France's influence throughout the region. Charles found himself making increasingly desperate alliances and taking greater risks to maintain his independence, ultimately leading to his death in battle at Nancy in 1477. The Burgundian inheritance was then divided between France and the Habsburg domains, eliminating a major threat to French security without the massive costs that a direct military campaign would have required. Machiavelli recognized that such sophisticated strategies required rulers to suppress their natural human impulses toward consistency and emotional satisfaction. The prince who insisted on punishing every slight or rewarding every loyalty would find his options severely constrained by his previous commitments. Successful leadership demanded the ability to maintain instrumental relationships based on calculated advantage rather than personal feelings. This requirement for emotional discipline extended to the prince's inner circle as well. Advisors who became too attached to particular policies or relationships could become liabilities if circumstances changed. The ruler needed to surround himself with individuals who understood that loyalty meant adapting to changing requirements rather than defending fixed positions. This created a court culture where flexibility and pragmatism were valued above personal friendship or ideological commitment. The challenge was made more complex by the fact that this instrumental approach to relationships had to be concealed from those who were its targets. People who understood that they were being manipulated would naturally seek to escape or retaliate, defeating the purpose of the manipulation. The prince therefore needed to become an accomplished actor, capable of projecting sincerity, friendship, and moral commitment even when his actual motivations were entirely strategic. Ferdinand of Aragon's relationship with Christopher Columbus illustrated this principle perfectly. Ferdinand recognized the potential value of Columbus's proposed voyage while remaining skeptical about its chances of success. Rather than rejecting the proposal outright or providing massive support that might be wasted, he offered minimal backing that would allow him to claim credit if the venture succeeded while limiting his losses if it failed. More importantly, Ferdinand structured his agreement with Columbus in ways that ensured Spanish control over any discoveries while making Columbus believe he was receiving generous treatment. The explorer was granted impressive sounding titles and promised substantial rewards, but the actual legal framework gave the Spanish crown ultimate authority over all colonial enterprises. When Columbus's discoveries proved enormously valuable, Ferdinand was positioned to benefit fully while Columbus found himself increasingly marginalized despite his crucial role in the initial success. This ability to structure agreements that appeared favorable to all parties while actually serving the prince's interests required sophisticated understanding of human psychology and legal technicalities. The successful ruler needed to be part diplomat, part lawyer, and part psychologist, capable of identifying what different people truly wanted and crafting arrangements that seemed to provide it while actually serving his own objectives. As Machiavelli concluded his analysis of the fox and lion principles, he understood that he was describing a form of leadership that would be deeply disturbing to those who preferred simpler moral categories. The prince who mastered both force and deception would be capable of achieving remarkable success, but at the cost of the personal authenticity that many people considered essential to human dignity. Yet Machiavelli remained convinced that this sacrifice was justified by the alternative. History was littered with the remains of kingdoms destroyed by rulers who were too honest to lie, too compassionate to use necessary force, or too consistent to adapt to changing circumstances. The prince who wished to preserve his state and protect his subjects had no choice but to master the full range of political techniques, regardless of their moral implications. The final lesson, therefore, was that effective leadership required not just the willingness to abandon conventional morality, but the intelligence to know which moral principles to violate and when. The truly dangerous prince was not the one who rejected all ethical constraints, but the one who could appear virtuous while acting ruthlessly, who could inspire loyalty while manipulating his supporters, and who could maintain power through methods so subtle that his victims never fully understood how they had been defeated. In the pre-dawn darkness of his exile, as he set down his quill for the final time, Machiavelli had completed his education in the dangerous arts of power. The prince would scandalize Europe for centuries to come, but it would also provide an unflinching examination of how political authority actually operated beneath the comforting myths of divine right and moral leadership. For those with the courage to look beyond conventional pieties, it offered a roadmap to effectiveness in the brutal arena where the fate of nations was ultimately decided. The candle guttered out, leaving only the faint light of dawn to illuminate the manuscript that would forever change humanity's understanding of power and its proper employment. In the pages Machiavelli had written lay the distilled wisdom of centuries of political experience, transformed into lessons that would prove as relevant to modern readers as they had been to the princes of Renaissance Italy. The dangerous education was complete, waiting for those bold enough to embrace its implications and skilled enough to employ its methods without being consumed by them. The influence of Machiavellian thought would extend far beyond the small Italian states that inspired its creation, shaping the minds of rulers from Napoleon to modern political leaders who understood that the principles of effective power transcended any particular historical moment. In boardrooms and presidential palaces, in diplomatic negotiations and military planning sessions, the ghost of Niccolò Machiavelli would continue to whisper his dangerous truths about the price of leadership and the harsh mathematics of political survival. Those who listened would wield influence far beyond their apparent resources, while those who rejected his lessons would find themselves outmaneuvered by more adaptable adversaries who understood that in the game of power, moral purity was often indistinguishable from strategic incompetence.